Hey class, welcome to our second week of terrorism. I think this should be a good start. Monday's a good start to our week as we explore Module 2. Last week we had a real good introduction, I think. Great introduction. Everyone kicked off and including information about yourself, where you're from, what the reason that you wanted to take the class. So I think all the discussions went really well. We had a real good discussion last week. We explored the definitions of terror and terrorism. We talked about the differences between terrorism, and terrorist. Okay, those are certainly different. We discussed the purpose of terrorism, why organizations choose to attack civilian populations and the government, and some of their different goals. We took a look at the Mike German video. Mike was a anti-terrorism, counterterrorism expert, if you will, with the FBI, and he shared some of his thoughts on where terrorism has been and where he believes that it's going in the future today as well as there in the future. So I think we had a real good discussion last week about terrorism, and first discussion, second discussion about terrorist organizations, why you believe terrorists are motivated, in the background of terrorism. So good job on that. Extended discussions. Everyone contributed to not only the initial discussion post, but you also took time to offer some really extended, in-depth discussions with the other students. So thank you for doing that. And as just a quick reminder, please continue to do that. Please continue to include those in-depth initial discussions, include those citations and references, and reach out to other students by posting a minimum of 2 times in the discussion board. If you see someone struggling, someone that's writing an initial discussion but no one's replying to it, please take time to jump in. So that may be 3 or 4 discussion entries, but I guarantee you that by doing that, I do see that, and you will be rewarded in your grading. So what are we doing in Module 2? We had a real good basic understanding of terrorism. So in Module 2, we're going to move forward and continue to explore where terrorism started. Okay, we learned a little bit last week, but we'll really get in depth about where terrorism started. So why terrorism? Where did it come from? Well, terrorism has always been here. Okay, some form of terrorism has always been around. You know, if you're a religious person, you can read the scripture and see where some of those old kingdoms, there was always terrorism, there was always war, always some sort of fighting going on. And we'll see that in our module this week. We'll read about the Jewish Sicarii. They used terrorism in the Palestinian territories to bring about political change, something that, continues today with Hamas and some of the different groups. And keep in mind, in the Palestinian territories wasn't what you see today. Israel and that whole region was considered to be Palestine. It wasn't broken up like it is today. Under the British agreement, it was broken up because, Britain controlled that area at one time, and that's why we call it different today. The Palestinian territories are different, but the whole region had some sort of fighting, much like they did today, and that's where we saw the Jewish Sicarii, and that's where we see Hamas at today. Okay, so we saw in the French Revolution, if you're big on studying history, you know about the French Revolution. That was happened during the time that the United States was starting. Not long after, we had Benjamin Franklin, who was involved in France. He was a special envoy. And so in the French Revolution, the term terrorism was coined as part of that. We had terror all over that kingdom at that time, when it transitioned, from a monarchy to being what it is today, a constitutional form of government. So that's where the term terrorism actually started. Okay, and then in the 11th century we had the Assassins. The Assassins, this was a Shiite Muslim sect. We still have Shia today that utilized terrorism for the same reason that the Sicarii did. Okay, to influence political leadership in the region. They did the same thing, and you see how the connection of the old to today, it's continued throughout history. Okay. It is possible that the legend of the assassins lives on today with Hamas. Now, that's what the people in that area say, is that they have this direct connection to the assassins group. So I guess they were considered terrorists, but more like, I guess from the other side, maybe they were considered the special forces of that time, maybe. I don't know, with Hamas. And then it's also believed the same thing with ISIL, and then what's left of Al Qaeda. Not much left of Al Qaeda, but it still exists, especially in those African regions, those African states. It seems to be alive there much more than it is in the Middle East. Still have it in Yemen, but again, much more in those African countries. And I think that's one of the reasons that you see the United States military really building up in those African regions more than we have in years past. So moving on. So what I want you to do this week is please consider comparing and contrasting the differences and the similarities between those groups of old and the groups today, the Jewish Sicarii, the groups in the French Revolution that we talk about in the chapter 2 of our book. Contrast those old groups to where we are today. Is there a connection? Is there not a connection? There's some other groups that we need to focus on. We tend to focus on terrorism in the Middle East because we see it so much in the news, but there's so many other groups that we often overlook that's associated with terrorism throughout history. These groups include the thugs, the Fenians, the Chinese secret societies, and those were very important during the time, China went through its own process of changing governments, if you will, from a monarchy to more of a state of communism today. Some say that that's not the case. It's more of a dictatorship. Maybe it is. The Roman societies, and then the anarchists, not just the anarchists that we have here in the United States, but anarchists that lived and operated in the Middle East and in the UK and parts of what is today's European Union. And then domestically, there's tons of domestic groups that we need to take a look at historically. There's lots of historic groups that we think about and some we don't think about. One of the oldest groups today has been identified as a domestic terrorist group is the Klan, the KKK. Those guys have been around a long time, and all the way back to the Civil War, pre-Civil War days, if you will, all related to slavery in controlling people, terrorizing the population. The Puerto Rican independence groups, we don't hear much about them, but that's still alive today. Puerto Rico is part of the United States, but there's still groups that want it to be its own island nation, not just a commonwealth of the United States. And so in Puerto Rico, you have these terrorism groups that are trying to influence a vote, where the population is influenced and they vote for independence from the United States. But they don't want just independence. They want their own state of independence, not a democracy. They want communism to take place there, to change the role of government so that they can control it. We just don't hear much about them. But the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, some others are well aware of it, and they work really hard to try to control that. We don't have that big of an issue, as far as I know, with some of the other commonwealths. So there's lots of islands that we have as commonwealths, some you've probably never even heard of, or that we're connected with, such as the Marshall Islands, which has a connection to the United States. They're independent, but they do have a connection to the United States. They can travel here, work here, etc. And then we had the Weather Underground. Now, the Weather Underground, if you go back and take a look at some of the recent elections the last 8 years, the Weather Underground was discussed a great deal. They really wanted to influence politics, and so they were active. They actually carried out some bombings back in the 70s, the 60s, 70s, especially during that Vietnam era, if you will, even before and after that. And then the Black Liberation Army, and then there's a whole host of others. We've seen some new names come up recently. I'm not sure how well these guys are organized, but with the terrorist activities that's taken place today against law enforcement officers and military and everybody else, some of these are homegrown terrorists and not really connected with a national group like an Al-Qaeda or a ISIL, anything like that. There may be a small splinter group, if you will. So one of the things that we notice about these groups, as I mentioned in our announcement, if you read that, is some of them are considered to be left-wing groups while others are identified as being right-wing. And if you follow politics, you know the difference between the left and the right wing. The left-wing groups primarily have associated themselves with socialism, communism, eco rights, animal rights, and anarchy. One of the things that I've had the opportunity to work with is we actually had a protest here where I'm at, and the team that I was a part of then was deployed to try to protect the public as well as to prepare for any weapons of mass destructions that may have occurred at the time, and that was with ALF, the Animal Liberation Front. Those guys came here to Little Rock and protested Stevens Inc., which owned a large amount of the Huntington Group based in the UK, which conducted experiments on animals. And so they protested, and it was just a huge mess. People arrested and placed into jails and transported, and most of them were not violent, but many were violent. And because of their history with terrorism, their potential connection to terrorism, bombings, and carrying those things out, we were really concerned here in a community that's a lot smaller than, certainly New York, and that we would have an incident that we could not handle. But we really did a good job of doing that, and we were prepared for rioting and weapons of mass destruction, anything else that came along with that. So it gave me a real good idea, a very good sense of what these groups are like and how they carry out their actions. While you have a group up front protesting at the police line, you'll have others in the back that are watching and filming law enforcement and the anti-terrorism teams and FBI, trying to identify and watch what they do so that they can better have an understanding and take that back to their groups and learn from them, so that next time they hold a protest or next time they decide to carry out an action, whether it's a bombing or whatever, they will have a better understanding of how to do that. And then, of course, we see the Earth Liberation Front, which is ELF, and their goal there is to protect the environment. What's interesting about these groups is they're willing to destroy mankind. They're willing to injure you and me in order to take a life or several lives, if necessary, in order to protect what they think is important. I don't really understand the balance there, because I don't think there is a balance. And then we also have the Common Action Group, which supports just total anarchy. They don't want any rules. They don't want any government in the world at all. What they want to do is just destroy the governments, let there be anarchy, and then they can do whatever they want in these different little groups. But the thing is about society with the anarchists is that without rules, some sort of rules, society falls. It fails. We have to have rules in order to operate. For instance, if we have total anarchy, which is what some of these groups want, they're willing to carry out acts of terrorism to do it, and have, then that means that I can just go take your car. There's no rules. I can just go get your car if I want to and take it for a drive, or take money from the bank that doesn't belong to me, etc. So comparably, the right-wing groups include the Klan, white supremacist organizations, and a host of radical religious and anti-political groups. They very conservative groups. They're conservative in their own way, if you will. They're conservative as long as as long as it's their form. So they're willing to carry out different acts and including terrorism, in order to get what they want, whether it's taking the life of someone else or bombing a federal building or whatever. And we see that if you compare Timothy McVeigh, what he did in Oklahoma City, he was a part of these organizations. He was considered to be a right-wing terrorist, if you will, because he had the influence of these different white supremacist organizations in survival groups. Now, all survivalists are not, or preppers or whatever, are not bad people. They're just preparing for disasters, as we all should. But in this particular case, he was part of this right-wing group that used religion as their basis for carrying out activities. So we see how there's a connection between today, modern times, and what happened in the old times, the biblical times, there with the Jewish Sicarii and some of the other groups. And they all believed that they were right, and they were willing to take a life for that. And so we'll explore all those groups more as we take a look at our textbook as well as our outside links. Okay. So I'm hoping this will be a very good discussion. I think it'll be a very good module, very good week. Take a look at some of the discussions on intelligence. Again, contribute to those discussions. Don't forget about your blogs and your journals. And I would encourage you to look at that final project that we will have due. Don't wait till the last week to do the final project. Get started on it. It'll be too late. Now, please remember to include the citations and the references in everything that you do. If you're challenged with APA, please let me know. Please use those library links that I previously sent, the Writing Center links. Those will help you. But send me an email. I will try to work with you and give you some examples. And if we do grading this week, I will include those examples in your grade. So please take time to look at the comments that I provide in your feedback and all of your grading. I try to have your grading done by Wednesday. That's not always possible, but I certainly will have it done by next Sunday. I have 7 days from the close of the module to get your grading in. I always try to do that a little bit earlier. Now, sometimes I take time, as I mentioned in our video or live session. It takes me a little bit longer because I read every discussion, every paper, every reply. So it takes me a little bit longer than maybe some others, because I want to make sure that I'm getting everything that you're saying and that you get the best grade possible. Okay, so what can I do to make your journey better at SNHU? If you ever have any questions, you need any help, please reach out to me 24/7, 365. I'll do everything I can to help you to understand the material, write a reference for you if you're trying to go into grad school, anything like that. So thanks for taking time to watch the video. If you have any questions, please let me know, and let's have a great week.